The Russian army has performed severely under expectations in the ongoing invasion. Many people expected Russia to just cut through Ukraine and take the capital in 3 days. However, that's not what happened. They got bogged down inside of the country for many reasons, and I'm here to explain them. There's been a point where up to 40-mile-long convoys were stuck for days at a time because of the lack of fuel. Russia never had enough fuel trucks to support logistics more than 160 kilometers from their border for an extended period of time. That was an assessment made by an independent journalist, but it really makes sense if you look at the front. When they tried to invade through Chernihiv, they made it about 160 kilometers but then got stopped. When they invaded in the North Sumy Oblast, they made it about 160 kilometers and then they got stopped. When they invaded through Kherson from Crimea, they made it about 160 kilometers and then stopped. It was about a bit north of Mykolaiv and by Voznesensk. They hoped that they would just walk into Ukraine and not face resistance, so they wouldn't need a whole ton of fuel, but that's not what happened. Instead, Russia relies majorly on rail lines for its logistics because of their lack of adequate fuel trucks. You can see how the major advances in the beginning of the war were anchored around these rail lines. Logistics have been extremely mismanaged during Russia's war efforts so far, and the problems only get worse as Ukraine destroys more supply routes. And sometimes the logistics don't even matter because of the quality of the equipment. Some Russian trucks and APCs were found with popped, cheap tires that weren't rated for the weight of the vehicle. It exposes corruption deep inside of the Russian military because the commanders just pocketed the money for the more expensive tires, and that resulted into the vehicle never making it into combat at all. The Russian military follows a very top-down structure, where the people sitting in Moscow have more control over the battlefield than the people actually on the battlefield. A good example of this is when Russia tried to do a river crossing into Belarus multiple times. The first time this happened, Ukraine destroyed the bridge and didn't allow the Russians to cross the river. The generals on the field wanted to cross at a different spot, but the officials in Moscow told them to just keep crossing at this same spot. They kept doing it over and over again until they lost about an entire battalion group worth of equipment and men. This is also what happened in Le Mans when the Russians refused to move the reinforcements away from their more properly defended cities to protect their flanks from the advancing Ukrainians. And that is eventually what led to the settlement's downfall. Another big reason is just how many interest groups are involved in the war. Inside the Ukraine front, there is the professional Russian army, which has been trained in combat, and they have trouble accommodating the new, less experienced mobilized troops. And both of these are at odds with Wagner, who is conducting their own offensives in the war. Meanwhile, the DPR and LPR militias are trying to gain political clout by conducting their own offensives, and then there's the Chechens trying to gain political power, and the whole invasion is a patchwork of different sides doing stuff for their reputations instead of progress. There's been a general trend of politics influencing decisions more than actual good ideas. I'll be honest with you guys, Russia should have just regrouped after they lost the battles of Mykolaiv and Voznesensk. The Kherson front stalled after the third week of March, and holding the bridgehead across the Dnieper was a death sentence. Once Ukraine received HIMARS, they started pounding the bridge, making resupply very difficult. Russia could have never mounted an offensive to take over Odessa after they lost their original momentum and Ukraine had HIMARS. They should have just pulled out earlier to press the advantage they had near Severodonetsk to keep pushing into Siversk instead of taking a 2-week operational pause that killed their momentum and allowed the Ukrainians to set up strong defense in Siversk. The main thing that stopped this was Putin not wanting to retreat and lose an important city. The political aura of the city turned a beneficial and logical reorganization and retreat into a devastating prolonged loss. And just generally, the Russian troops don't necessarily know what they're fighting for. This war is a great example of how the motivation of conquest and motivation of survival differ from each other. When I talked about the Russian army and Wagner being at odds with each other, if you thought that was interesting, I'm going to put out a whole video tomorrow that has a big segment about that inside of it. It's mainly about the defense of Bakhmut and how Ukraine has been able to hold on to the city and the current battle between Defense Minister Shvigo and Prigozhin of the Wagner group. So yeah, that video is going to be coming out tomorrow. I'll see you guys later. Thank you to my channel members Gene Helfrich, Stig Grun, Butleresque, David Appel, Delo Mathatas, Phil Martin, Robert Jenkins, Richard Quadri, Focus Pocus 100, Evan Shin, Rye Jones, Mr. Walkman, and a special thanks to my third tier members Ashley C137, Joel Raindell, Mike Q, Joe Sauer, PG, JG Bashla. Thank you to my channel members Gene Helfrich, Stig Grun, Butleresque, David Appel, Delo Mathatas, Phil Martin, Robert Jenkins, Richard Quadri, Focus Pocus 100, Gazby, Evan Shin, Rye Jones, Mr. Walkman, and a special thanks to my third tier members Ashley C137, Joel Raindell, Mike Q, Joe Sauer, PG, JG Bashlow, Maxim Zavarshinsky, and Jane Dungu. Let me know if I got that one right. See you later.